being here tonight. Welcome, everyone. This is a second Town Projects Fair and Forum. We had one last week that had two different projects as kind of the focal point. Tonight's focal point, as I think people know, is the MBTA Communities Initiative that's been led by the Planning Board, the Town Planner, working with consultant support and really engaging many people in the community, both within the town offices and in the community at large. It's a big initiative. There's a lot of work to get us to this point. There's still quite a lot of work ahead, but we really want to thank everyone for being here. And as you can see, we set up the room to highlight some other projects going on, partly because there is a lot going on, and we thought it would be a good opportunity to get people together and to share information about other projects, but also really to convey that the town, as it's looking at this specific initiative, as well as the two highlighted projects last week, which is the Route 113 corridor study, as well as the MVP River Road project, the town really is looking at each of these things not in isolation, but at the interrelationships and the big picture and how they all fit together. So that was part of the idea behind the Town Projects Fair and Forum, is to really help draw out some of those relationships between the various initiatives ongoing in town. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Planning Board Chair, Brian Murphy, who will then also introduce the consultants who will give the presentations.
Good. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm not going to elaborate. Thank you, Angus. A good summary of where we are. We've been working on this for probably 6+ months, the MBTA Communities Act, and they'll give you another brief description of what that is and how we've gotten to this point. There's more work to be done. None of this is a final fait accompli at this point. We are hoping to come to Springtown meeting with a zoning article with the suggested changes to our zoning to meet this requirement from the state. Our consultants, Dylan Sussman and Peter Flinker, the floor is yours. You can take it away. All right.
Let's go start. You want me to sit and hit the...
Okay, I could do that if you'd like, Peter.
Good evening.
Oh.
Next slide.
Next slide.
All right. Next slide. So,
It's just like Zoom.
yeah, it's just like Zoom. We're just going to keep on going at that pace. So I'm Dylan Sussman. I'm from Dodson and Flinker. We're a landscape architecture and planning firm from Northampton, Massachusetts. And we are the town's consultants for this effort to adopt zoning or to put forth zoning to comply with a new state law called the MBTA Communities Law. There are just a couple slides here that introduce the law. We've done a number of presentations, one in this room back in June, as well as a number to Planning Board. So for some of you, this will be repetitive, and for some of you, I guess it'll be new, because I see some new faces tonight. So the MBTA Communities Law it's a state law that was, it's a part of the zoning code, the state zoning statute, and it requires that every community that is within the MBTA service area or adjacent to those communities adopt a zoning district that allows, just checking what's on the slide here, that allows it allows multifamily housing by right at a density of, a minimum density of 15 units per acre. So West Newbury is designated as an adjacent small town because you're adjacent to a community with an MBTA station. So you're like 177 other communities in the state that are wrapping their heads around what this means for them. Next slide. So like I said, the law requires the town to adopt at least one zoning district. It has to allow at least 15 dwelling units per acre. So a dwelling unit is a complete living quarters for one household. It means it has to have at least a place to sleep, a place to eat and to cook, and a place to use the facilities. So that's a dwelling unit. So the zoning has to allow up to 15 dwelling units per acre. And a dwelling unit, a multifamily dwelling or a multifamily house or apartment building is defined as 2 or more dwelling units on a lot, or it's 2 to 3 units in a dwelling, or 2 units, each of which has 2 dwelling units in them. So basically, it's saying you can have a 3-family on a lot, and that's multifamily, or you can have two families on a lot, and that's multifamily. So that's what's required. Next slide. The law there are guidelines to the law that set a minimum number of units that every community has to zone for, and that is based on basically how close you are to an MBTA station and how big your community is. So you guys are at the lowest threshold of requirement, and for West Newbury, it means that the town has to have a zoning capacity, a minimum zoning capacity of 87 units. We were just at a meeting in Burlington, Mass. Their zoning capacity is like 924 units. So, you know, very different scales here. You're on the low end of what's required. If you zone for 87 units at 15 units per acre, it means you need a minimum land area of about 5.8 acres. So basically what this is saying is, at a minimum, the town, to comply with the law, has to zone about 6 acres. It has to allow about 15 units per acre, multifamily housing by right. Next slide. So some of you might be wondering, what happens if we don't comply with the law? So first of all, it's a state law. It's just like any other law that's out there. You're supposed to comply with the law. It's illegal not to comply with the law. So there are some consequences if you don't. There's like about 15 grant programs that the state offers, some of which are substantial, like MassWorks, which is the state's main infrastructure funding program, that the town will not qualify for if you don't comply with the law. So there's a money stick attached to this. You'll lose out on significant grant funds if you don't comply. You also might be subject to either civil enforcement or enforcement of state and federal fair housing laws. So it's, you know, complying is something to take seriously. So Peter is going to walk you through some concept plans for properties that we're looking at for potential zoning districts. We went through a process of looking at the entire town, analyzing what properties seem viable for multifamily housing based on physical constraints, things like steep slopes and wetlands and floodplains, regulatory constraints, things like wetland buffers or river protection areas, and then also just properties that seem like they would be not viable to be developed, things like cemeteries or town-owned properties or protected open space. And so through that process of basically knocking out all the land that was not really suitable for multifamily housing, we settled on essentially the Main Street corridor as the most likely place for multifamily housing, or the most suitable place for multifamily housing, in part because it has your sort of most robust transportation infrastructure. It's got a road that's already carrying traffic and is able to carry traffic. It has sidewalks in some places. It also, in some places, is served by drinking water, which is important if you're trying to develop additional housing. And then from that, we looked at the larger parcels, the ones that seemed like they could, you know, handle 6 or 7 acres of new development that didn't already have a single family house on it that was unlikely to be developed into something further. And basically landed on 3 properties. So we landed on the Knapp property, which is 187 Main Street, the Dunn greenhouse property, former greenhouse property. They're both former greenhouse properties, which is, I think, 347 Main Street, but don't quote me on that. And then we also looked at the Mullen property, which is a town-owned property that's been looked at in the past for housing development. Went through a process with the planning board, developed concept plans for all three of those, and then have since ruled out the Mullen property. And we're focused now on just the Knapp property and the Dunn property. The reason the Mullen property was excluded from consideration, I think, is because the law sets out requirements for town-owned properties that are more onerous than privately owned properties. The law is really intended to be stimulating development on private property, not on public property. And so if you were to move forward with the Mullen property, the town would basically need to be well on its way to selling that property or giving it to a private developer at the time of zoning adoption for the zoning to be compliant with the state law. And that all seemed very, very complicated and very difficult to accomplish within the timeline that the town is trying to achieve, which is bringing this to adoption, to town meeting for consideration in the spring. The other thing is that the state law sets a limit, or the guidelines of the state law set a limit on how much affordable housing you can require as part of this zoning. It sets a limit of 10%. And when the town has looked at the Mullen property for housing in the past, it's been considering a higher percentage of affordable housing than what the state law allows. So I think the conclusion that was come to about the Mullen property was that it's a great opportunity for the town if they're looking to pursue housing, but not the best opportunity for this MBTA community zoning. Okay, so Peter is going to now talk about the concept plans for the Knapp and the Dunn properties.
So you're familiar with both of those properties. They're old greenhouse sites. You may have shopped there over the years, but both of them go way back from the road, and you may not be familiar with how much land is there. So Knapp property has relatively narrow frontage on Main Street, but it goes way back. But the back third of it, it sort of rises up to a hill and then goes back down again. And the back of it is mostly wetlands. So of the 19 acres, not all of it is developable. The next slide, Dylan. So this is looking at it from a different direction. This is north facing up. Here are the greenhouses. This is the property boundary. So it's this long, narrow property with wetlands in the back, a big field, and then the greenhouses in the front. So in terms of, what we look at and what we're trying to encourage with the zoning is development that actually enhances a neighborhood and enhances the town, rather than, there's always the joke that, what do you name a subdivision after, right? It's the thing that you get rid of, like Open Meadow Estates or Deer Run, right? There's no longer any deer or meadow there. But here we're actually trying to preserve as much as possible of the beautiful open space, if that's on a property, or wetlands, of course, have to be protected under state law, but really to use the development to create something that's not going to be just an eyesore. And so Dylan's going to talk later about the design standards that go along with the zoning that are really intended to make it the best possible kind of development for each of these sites. Really forcing people to go through a process of thinking about the design more deeply than they typically would with a subdivision. So when we look at this site, for the purpose of these sort of demonstration plans, again, these are just imaginary plans that are meant to guide future development. They're not the future development plan itself. So, but when we look at it, we're trying to demonstrate some of these principles of good design, one of which is let's protect what we can of the site while we're developing it. So when we look at this, that big open meadow with the view from Main Street is really beautiful. You don't see a lot of it, but it's a really beautiful view. So can we protect that? Can we, create some buffers to the wetlands that go beyond the minimum buffers required by the law? Can we reuse some of the parcel that's already been developed rather than just digging up the green part of the property and not reusing the greenhouses in that area? And so the plans are really keeping those kind of things in mind. So the next one shows, zooming in a little bit, talking about the previously developed area up by the roadside. You have that, you can see the contours here, there's kind of a knoll in the middle, and then it wraps around and down toward the wetlands. So the next slide shows one potential development, which is development of this entire, sort of if you drew a line around this, this would be about the 6 acres that we're aiming for to get the minimum density under the law. So if you zone that 6 acres for 15 units an acre, it's about 90 units, which meets the town's requirement to create at least 87 units. One of the things we want to point out is that, as you know, the whole town is on private wastewater or shared wastewater systems, mostly large septic systems, and this would probably be served by a similar kind of system. Under the state law, under Title V, there's this cutoff point at 10,000 gallons a day, which if you produce more wastewater than that, you have to have a much higher standard of treatment, which basically is a much more expensive treatment plant with much more oversight forever. The good thing about that is you get better water quality coming out of it. The bad part of it is very expensive, and it's unlikely that anyone would be able to afford to build just 90 units with a private wastewater plant, and 90 units is about 20,000 gallons a day. All of which is to say that what's more likely is somebody is not going to build 90 units on any of these properties. It's probably going to be more like 30 or 40 units. So the next slide I'm going to show you is, we won't go there yet, but the next one is showing one that fits under the 10,000 gallons a day. So looking at this property, we're sort of starting by, how can we enhance that experience from Main Street? Let's protect the view of that big open meadow. Let's reuse some of that development. So this is like redeveloping that existing house for 2 or 3 houses, maybe turning the barn into another 2 or 3 houses, and having a driveway with some parking areas that sort of curves around a lovely green space, and then have the main road come in along the edge of the property and wrapping around the hill. And we won't go into all the details, but this fits very nicely within the topography of the site. It also brings the entrance of the road across, directly across from, what's the name of the road across the street? Harrison. So it basically creates a right angle intersection with the other road. It's at the base of this curve, so there's good sight lines in both directions, etc. So this seems like a good place to have that entrance because it avoids impacts on the visual character and fits well with the site, and then provides this opportunity for a little cluster of homes as you come in. And as we move further to the south, there's room on the sort of the back part of the site for a larger cluster of buildings. And in this case, this could include a combination of townhouses. So these are homes with a shared wall. And these 2 structures might have 4 units in each one, but also some small apartment buildings. So this is like a 16-unit apartment building at 2.5 stories. And then some apartments where they're sort of stacked up above each other in units that are designed to look more like big single-family houses. And in fact, if you put these next to a lot of the houses, the single-family houses that you have here in town, they would probably be smaller since you have some big houses. But the idea, and this is captured in the design standards, is to really have architecture that feels like big rambling country houses, not shoebox apartments that you see down by the highway. And then the other idea here is to focus the view as you come around here on this nice green space, to have parking that is placed behind the buildings or inside the buildings or to the side of the buildings, not right out in the front yard, right? So it's really kind of a village-style plan where you come in and you see a beautiful green space, you see the front yards and front porches, and it feels like you've really arrived in a community rather than just another subdivision. Next one is a 40-unit plan, and you'll notice the footprint is quite similar. We have the entrance, we have a little loop road, we have a larger loop in the back, but in this case, it's less than half the number of total units. So what these are is sort of smaller, more traditional house types. Some of them connected, most of them connected as duplexes. And so again, with shared parking in between the units so that you're not looking right into the garages on the side and in the rear. Here there's sort of 4 clusters of 2 that share a driveway. But again, the principle is to arrive at the beautiful part of the site, have the parking sort of tucked behind or in between the buildings, and then have a lot of trees planted around, continuous sidewalks that link all the different parts of the property, and also continue into the rest of the site, which is going to be protected. Do we have details of this one? Yes. So in the front, again, there's sort of what you see from the road is the entrance drive, a big open space, cluster of houses. And one of the things we're trying to do with these is sort of capture the sense you get when you drive through a typical New England town like West Newbury, which is you come through an open space and then into a dense cluster of houses and then back into the open space again. It's varied and interesting, right? And so we can do that, both as we drive along Main Street, but also as we come into the property, sort of open, more dense and interesting, then open again. If we go to the south part, you come to that big open green space, which is big enough for recreational purposes. Kids can go play ball there. But then each house then has sort of a formal side facing this green space, where you can have front porches and walks coming up to the porch from a sidewalk that rings the whole thing. And in the back, you have private space, so there can be, whether or not this is, well, there's probably going to be condominium ownership, but each unit can have its own designated space with a private view out into the surrounding woods and wetlands. So again, a lot of this is stuff which any private developer would do in a market like this to try to make a really nice quality development. What we're really trying to do is then capture this in the design standards to make sure that they have to do it. Again, so that in the end, this really becomes something which is an asset to the town and not just another eyesore that you say, well, it's too bad they did that. This is the Dunn property, which is very similar sort of ideas. We'll go a little bit more quickly on this. 15 acres. Again, you don't see much of it from the road because there's a steep hillside here, and the driveway sort of curves up around that hill to get in the back where there's the farmland. And we have some base maps of that on the next slide. So this is looking at parcel boundary here. And again, we're sort of looking at this beautiful big open knoll, which seems like a really great thing to try to protect. There's this other area where you have some existing greenhouse development in an area that's not really visible, which seems like a good place to develop. And then you have the area up toward Main Street, which is already developed. So if we go to the next slide, it shows one option for that. And again, this is again with the 87 or 90 unit plan. And this has, again, designed to be kind of a varied experience as you come in on the main road. You look up at the protected open space on either side, and then you come into something which is designed to feel like a real cohesive neighborhood. So we go to the next slide. It's again looking at, this is a larger apartment structure with maybe 20 or 22 units. We've got townhouses, which are sort of individual single family units that share a side wall, and then some smaller apartment buildings that the units are stacked up above each other. But again, we're trying to orient the buildings so they have kind of a formal face, which faces the sort of public space on the street, and then they also have, to the extent possible, private deck spaces to the rear. They can look out in the open space, or in this case, there's kind of a parking court on one side and a shared green space on the other between these rows of townhouses, and a pathway that leads up to this larger apartment. So again, it's sort of taking a cue from a lot of development we're seeing now, which tries to mix different kinds of housing types together, which is good from a demographic standpoint, because we need lots of different kinds of housing types, because we're no longer all, two-parent families with 3 kids. We're much more varied demographically. And so the apartments provide for smaller units, for younger people or older people. The townhouses, of course, can accommodate anybody. Larger duplexes might be for families. So it's really, again, trying to enhance the overall inventory of housing in the town by providing more diversity that can meet many different needs of different people without having to move to a different part of town and live in an ugly condominium when you're young, move into a big single-family house when you have a family and then have to move back to the condominium. It might be staying within a single community like this throughout your life. What's next? Right, so this is the last one, which is, again, the 40-unit plan. So the previous one was 90 units. This is 40, more likely to be the scale of actually going to be developed on these sites because of the septic requirements. So in this case, if you go to the next one, we come up and we have that long loop road. Loops are necessary because you want to have public safety access that's not limited to just a long cul-de-sac. But they also give some opportunity to create some sub-neighborhoods within the overall project. So you come in, you sort of arrive at this big open space ringed with houses. Again, parking to the side or the rear, private space to the back, sort of more formal public space to the front, some shared open space for kids to run around in. This link provides access to some garages in between these building structures. And again, a variety of, in this case, mostly townhouse style units, but in sets of 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 units, giving it some variety as you go through. So here are, what are we seeing here? Dylan, are you taking over at this point? This is a very carefully coordinated presentation. Back to you.
So the idea with doing those concept plans of drawing out what development could look like on these sites was to both get a sense of what might be acceptable to the town within the parameters of the law, but then also to use the knowledge that's generated by drawing the plan as the inputs to writing the zoning, right? So that the zoning is based on the plan. A lot of times what happens when people write zoning is they kind of pull out abstract numbers that sound good, but there's no plan behind it. So when somebody goes to develop the site, they're applying abstract numbers to a real site, and it doesn't really work so well. So in this case, the concept plans drive the zoning. And in this, looking at just the zoning boundaries, the challenge under the MBTA communities law for sites like these is it requires 15 units per acre. The sites are big, so you've got 19 acres and 15 acres. If you were to zone the whole site, the whole Dunn site, for example, at 15 units per acre, you get to allowing 225 units, which is probably more than, maybe it's more than the town wants, and it's more than the law requires. So what's proposed is to basically split off, to adopt a zoning overlay district, which is zoning that sits on top of the base zoning. A property owner can opt into this overlay and get additional rights through it, but they can also do whatever was allowed under the underlying zoning. So adopt an overlay district that covers just portions of the parcel, not the whole parcel. So this is the NAP property here, and so it's covering most of the front, but excludes the fields on the west side of the property, which seemed like the most important part of this site to protect. It doesn't require that that be protected, but it excludes it from the potential for the multifamily housing. So it makes it more likely that if someone were to opt into this, they would take advantage of the multifamily housing provisions at the greater density. And then this portion can be used for open space to qualify for for open space that's required under the zoning. It can be used for septic, it can be used for stormwater management, and so forth. And then on the Dunn property, basically the zoning carves out the front of the site, a strip for access, and then the back of the site, and does not cover the big knoll on the east that seemed like the most important part of the site to try to reduce development potential. Each of these is in the neighborhood of 6 acres. They ended up being a little bit more in order to fit in the number of units that we're trying to get, and just to make something that seemed like it had enough wiggle room for somebody to be able to do a development that made sense. Next slide. So translated into, just zoning boundaries. The idea that the planning board is currently considering is to adopt 2 different overlay districts. They have the same standards, but they're 2 different mapped areas. So one for Knapp and one for Dunn. Either of those areas on its own would fulfill the town's requirements under the law. So a big question moving forward is, should the town adopt zoning for one of these areas, and if so, which one, or should it adopt zoning for both of them? I think the rationale for adopting zoning for both of them is, A, the town does have needs for diverse housing. So there's a sensible basis for this law. Whether the law itself makes sense, I'll leave that up to you. But there is a true housing crisis in Massachusetts. If you have a relationship with somebody who's been trying to buy a house and doesn't have a lot of money, or even has a lot of money but is in a high expense market, you've probably seen a lot of angst and a lot of challenges. There's a real need for housing, and there's a real need for smaller units than the single-family housing that dominates many communities like yours. So reason number 1 for adopting two districts is to fulfill the town's housing needs, to make more opportunities for older people, to make more opportunities for younger people, to make more opportunities for people who work in the town, who grew up in the town and can no longer afford to live here. And then reason number 2 is it sort of aligns with the spirit of the law. So recognizing that it's really unlikely that either of these sites is actually going to produce 90 units because of the town's challenges with wastewater treatment and its soils. Adopting 2 districts, 2 overlay districts, gets you closer to the number that the state is implying is a reasonable amount of units for the town to be zoning for, or heading towards producing. So those are the zoning districts. And then the other part of this for your consideration is, in the front of each of the sites is this red area. And the idea there is that mixed use would be allowed on the fronts of the sites. So mixed use is combining commercial uses and residential uses on the same lot or the same building. So you can think of, what's it called, the pizza house or the pizza factory? Something like that.
House of Pizza.
A house of pizza. Pizza company? Pizza company. All right.
We know the town so well.
The village center where our office is has Stars Pizza, A1 Pizza, Pizza Factory. Anyway, so I just picked some of those terms and hopefully one of them works. So think of the pizza company, the pizza, anyway, it has a shop on the lower floor and it has apartments on the upper floor, right? So that's mixed use. So both of these properties had some commercial use. They had agricultural commercial use on them before. Your commercial zoning district is barely legible on this map, but it's basically up in here, comes across the street, and then drops down right here and excludes the portion of the Dunn property that used to have the greenhouses. So the idea here is to allow mixed use, which would extend your commercial district a little bit further up the road, which probably would make sense regardless of this zoning change from compliance with the MBTA communities law, because it would enable commercial development across the street from other commercial development. on a portion of the lot that's actually possible to have commercial use on. And then also for the front of the now property where the greenhouses were. So some of the standards that are written into the zoning, so there's a draft of the zoning and it's on the town website now, maybe? Okay, just finished writing it last week, so it's a little fresh, but the planning board is gonna start reviewing it at their next meeting and subsequent meetings. So the zoning has a minimum sort of tract side to opt into the overlay district of 5 acres. So either of these sites would work, but you can't really subdivide them much and still opt into the zoning, right? So you couldn't split off like half of this and opt into the zoning. You need to use pretty much most of the entire overlay district to take advantage of its provisions. On the front part of Main Street, the front setbacks are basically based on the average of adjacent structures. So it's saying, make the front setbacks like what's there now along the street now. On the interior of the lot, the front setbacks are relatively short. They're a minimum of 5 feet. That's in an attempt to get a density that matches what's required by the law, while allowing things like townhouses and smaller multifamily buildings. So in order to fit smaller buildings on a lot as opposed to really big shoebox apartment buildings, you have to put them relatively close together and close to the street. And that actually, close to the street actually creates a nice walkable village center feel. So that's the front setbacks. Side setbacks, again, those are relatively short. It creates about 15 feet between the buildings, so 7.5 feet on each side. The rear setbacks are 10 feet. That applies to the rear setbacks between buildings. But as you can see on the concept plans, because of the shapes of the lots, it's pretty unlikely that buildings are going to butt up against each other on the rear. And in general, it's likely that this is going to be a condominium development or would-be condominium developments, that people are not going to actually draw individual lots for each of these houses. And so to some degree, these setbacks are kind of meaningless. But they're written into the zoning anyway because you have to have them. And then they apply, those same dimensions apply if somebody does do multiple buildings on one lot as a condo development. There's a buffer around the edge of the district, so where it touches something that's not in the district, there's a 30-foot buffer that's required, and then there's screening that's required if a new building is within 150 feet of an existing building. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the state law allows the communities to require 10% affordable housing, and so that's written into the zoning as a maximum. That's already in your current zoning, so basically we're just saying, yes, you still have to do that. Looking at parameters for site design, so as Peter mentioned, the concept plans showed loop roads, so the zoning encourages loop roads. They're good for fire access, but they're also good for shaping public open space within a community and creating interesting sort of clusters of houses that make something that feels like a neighborhood as opposed to just a road that goes straight back to the end of the property with a cul-de-sac at the end. Feels kind of like, might feel like a dead end. The design standards require a continuous network of pedestrian paths and sidewalks that link all parts of the development. It requires that buildings create a pedestrian scale streetscape. So that's part of that is the shorter front setbacks, having a nice relationship between the heights of the buildings and the width of the street, having front landscaping that creates a bit of a buffer between the sidewalk and the front of the building, and that buildings be grouped around common open spaces where possible. So again, you saw that idea in the concept plan of buildings that shaped open spaces, shaped shared places, shaped little commons, shaped little greens. And then sites should minimize impervious surfaces so that stormwater is soaking into the ground and replenishing your aquifers. Looking at open spaces and landscaping, there's a minimum 30% open space requirement, so 30% of the site has to be not paved, not have houses on it. Shared open spaces are required. There's a design standard that says that all the open spaces have to actually have a function. So a lot of time what happens is when a subdivision is laid out, there's a bunch of leftover space that's not really useful for development, and that gets used to fulfill an open space requirement. And it's not very useful space, it's leftover space. So there's a design standard in the zoning that says you have to show us that your open space is actually useful for something. You know, either it's useful for recreation, or it's useful for habitat, or it's useful because you intend to actually do some landscaping that makes it beautiful, or it provides a scenic vista, or something to that. Where are my native plant people? So I saw the invasive plant table back there. So the zoning requires native or low maintenance plants. So plants that don't require large amounts of fertilizer, don't require a large amount of irrigation, so forth. And then like the open space requirement, the landscaping itself has to have a function. So looking for landscaping that defines outdoor spaces or provides habitat or is beautiful to look at. Next slide. The design standards in the zoning establish allowed building types. So those are the building types that Peter was describing in the concept plans. So you could have duplexes, 2 families, either side by side or up down or front back. You can have townhouses, which are multiple, basically single family units that are attached on their side walls. And those can have 3 to 5 units. You can have stacked flats, which are units on top of each other, usually around a small shared corridor or a staircase. So those can have 3 to 10 units. You can have small apartment buildings with 8 to 24 units, or mixed-use buildings up to 20 units. And then there are some design standards for the buildings themselves. So the maximum height limit is 3 stories. All the buildings have to have a front entry that faces a street or a shared open space. The buildings can't have any walls that are longer than 40 feet without a jig or a jag that breaks up the massing of the building. So even if you have a larger apartment building, it needs to have some variation in its shape that makes it more in keeping with the size of the buildings that are currently in West Newbury. And then the same for roofs. Roofs can't be longer than 40 feet without a change in their height, or having a dormer, or changing direction. And then windows. This may be too much for you guys, but it makes sense to me. So windows have to be aligned vertically, and generally aligned. Not every one of them has to be exactly on top of the others, but generally aligned vertically, and generally aligned within floors. I was driving through down Main Street on my way here tonight and seeing all the houses with their lights on, right? And there's a pretty strong pattern in your community of buildings with windows that align. And then no more than 5 types of windows in a facade. So, not a triangular window here, and then a big square window here, and then a rectangular window here, and then another little rectangular window here, and then a long skinny window here. I think 5 is enough. So again, that may be too much for you. And we're looking for feedback on like what's too much, what's not enough in zoning standards. Next slide. Okay, parking requirements. The zoning sets a minimum of 1.5 spaces per units. Obviously, if you have an odd number of units, that gets rounded. It requires bicycle parking. Basically, it says that if there isn't a garage space dedicated for a unit, then there needs to be covered parking space, bicycle parking space that's available to that unit. with a percentage. All the parking has to be located to the rear of buildings or to their sides or within the building. There's an out that's the planning board has when that's not really feasible. There's a standard that curb cuts should be minimized. Basically, we're trying to keep the sidewalks as consistent as possible, and so they're not frequently interrupted by driveways. When you have a development with more buildings clustered in a smaller area, if every one of them has a driveway that's interrupting the sidewalk, basically you have more driveway than you have sidewalk, and it doesn't really feel that friendly to walk on. And then garages have to be set back at least 2 feet from the front facade, similar to what you see in this, in Drake's Landing. The garages can't dominate the facade, so no more than 1/3 of the facade of a building can be garage doors. Next slide. So all these design standards are basically, they're based on looking at places, West Newbury and similar places, and looking at sort of the historic patterns of development, and trying to come up with objective standards that define some of the basic characteristics of build form. The standards have to be objective because it's by right development. So the planning board will review projects through site plan review. They can't reject projects. They can't say, no, you can't do this project, but they can condition plans and say, you didn't meet this standard in this way. You didn't meet this standard, so we want you to do better in a specific way. So they can have objective design standards. And then the last part of this are bonuses. So again, looking for feedback on these. It's difficult to design bonuses when the law requires pretty dense development, and it's possible that nobody would really want to build more than what's allowed. But in case somebody wants to do more, there are two bonuses that are allowed. The first is for permanent protection of, of the remaining open space that's not covered in the zoning district. So we can't require through the zoning that land is protected. If we did, then it basically would be part of your calculation of 15 units per acre. And so it would be kind of like part of the zoning district, and then the number of allowed units would go way up. But we can incentivize its protection. So the incentive here is if you preserve it, then the allowed number of units in any building can increase by 1/3. The allowed number of dwelling units per acre can be increased to 20 units per acre. So that gives you a higher cap, but it may be difficult to fit that cap within the building types that are allowed, right? Because each of those building types had a limit on the number of units. So then the other bonus is if you provide more than 10% of affordable housing, if you go up to 20% affordable housing or more, then the number of units in the building can be increased by 1/3. So if you combine those two things together, maybe you get more units per acre, as long as somebody can viably do that within septic. You get some public benefits and something that might be useful for project proponent. So that's the end of the presentation.